There was a 7-year-old girl who looked much like me, named First Violin. She didn't have any musical knowledge, nor had she ever touched a violin, but she was the loudest kid in her grade.
There was a 9-year-old girl who looked much like me, named Pumpkin. She liked to climb to the tops of everything in sight while always looking down to honor the bugs and the stones. She liked to draw pictures of the fossils her father discovered, and she dreamed that their marrow-hungry frames were actually magical creatures.
There was a 12-year-old girl that looked much like me, named Weird. Although she was almost twice the age of the 7-year-old girl, instead of a violin, she inherited anxiety. She loved to dance alone in her room, but she found the furniture to be extremely inhibiting.
There was a 13-year-old girl who looked much like me, named Meredith. She liked to watch British comedy with her mom and compete in speech tournaments and all of the events where she could dream up new worlds. Once, she won first place, and she discovered the feeling of firsthand being rewarded for her creativity and her smarts instead of how well she put on her $2 eyeshadow from the drugstore.
There was a 16-year-old girl that looked much like me, named M. She wore the same bandana every day for a year and a half, and often wore too many layers and was occasionally mistaken for a homeless person.
There was a 15-year-old girl who looked much like me, named Mare. She had crushes on some of the girls in her class, and she really liked to listen to old records with them. Sometimes she drew pictures of them as superheroes, being not afraid to say yes and no to all of the things that they dreamed of. And when she once tried to tell her friend about these secret crushes, he told her that she wasn't allowed to do so because she was too pretty.
There was a 19-year-old girl that looked much like me, named Mongoose. Mongoose just survived her first Chicago winter, and she wore a bright orange winter hat that said Mongoose on it. And it wasn't really a cool hat, but with excessive wearing, it was a cult classic. When she turned 21, she lost her hat in a coat check, and with it, her name.
There was a 21-year-old girl who looked much like me, named the Blonde One. She liked to eat berries and laughed wildly, but she wrote down all of her woes in a tiny notebook that she kept hidden. She often dreamed of cutting off all of her hair and running away, but she was told specifically that she was not marketable this way.
There was a 27-year-old girl that looked much like me, named Jess, who made coffee every morning,
who procrastinated a lot,
watched Star Trek every night,
but made a mean breakfast taco,
and occasionally solved Rubik's Cubes.
She thought it was really funny how being an adult was sometimes like being a kid, but with bills.
Her parents told her that she had settled into herself, but she felt like she was waiting for something. She just wasn't sure what.
She didn't understand why so many people were okay with omitting female voices from the global narrative.
She met a girl.
She met a girl.
She fell in love.
She fell in love.
And,
as you do,
started a nonprofit organization.
We are Meredith and Jessica, and
we created and run a nonprofit arts organization
for adolescent girls called She Crew. So, in your gift bags that you received at your seat today, there was a little piece of paper inside of it, and on it it said, list every name that you've ever been called, ever. And we would love for you to fill out these lists for yourself. These names can be anything from your legal name to your nickname to pet names to the name someone's called you when they're very angry at you, to the name someone has called you when they loved you, to the names that strangers have called you. These slurs, the misidentifications, everything. And when you create this list for yourself, I want you to take note of the names that you actually associate yourself with. Because there's going to be some that you identify with and some that you do not. And I really want you to think about this next question. Do any of those names on your list actually encompass all of you? Probably not. So at the bottom of that list, I want you to write, but really I am blank. And go ahead and put the name you would like to be called, even if it's just for today.
Meredith and I started She Crew because we felt like some of our identities, the way we thought of ourselves, the names we had for ourselves when we were 12, 13, and 14, still affect us today, both in positive and negative ways. So we wanted to provide a safe space for girls to explore their artistic self-expression in a way that would empower themselves as well as others, as well as through a means that would be accessible by all.
We wanted this for our own selves. Because so many of the names on our own name lists have needed an outlet, but it wasn't always there. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, we are taught that things like art, self-expression, and sometimes even a voice is reserved for someone that is not me. And this can be for any variety of reasons: age, race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, etc., etc., etc.
And this can create the sense that the arts and self-expression are privileged exercise, like croquet, instead of a necessary exercise that goes hand in hand with healthy development and growing up. So when you start an empowerment program, having never started one before, you have to kind of unpack what empowerment is, or more realistically, what it is to you. To empower is to give the ability for somebody to do something, and hopefully through that thing, other doors open up.
Now, what really defined empowerment for us was a short list of things: female voices, the arts, and authenticity. And at first, when you hear that list, you might say, oh, well, that's pretty easy to accomplish because women do outnumber men in several out forms. It's not like women don't speak their minds, but the key word in our list here is authenticity. It's actually the reason why we're standing before you today is that word. Because we feel like our communities lack enough spaces where women can have their voices heard through an art form with authenticity.
So everyone in this room has been through adolescence, almost everybody, right? And you might remember it to varying degrees. Some of you might have blocked it out, but if you do remember it, you would know that just saying it was awkward, or you know, those 5 months when I should have worn deodorant and I didn't know that I should have worn deodorant were pretty bad, doesn't really encompass everything that is going on. And that's because this was the first time in our lives when we began to truly form our own identities. Everything was about who you were, who you weren't, what you liked, what you didn't like, and where you fit in the social order. This, mixed with everything else that you're going through, left a lot of us feeling like we weren't enough.
Now consider the narrative that we're asking adolescent girls to look for their own identities. From media to music to traditional narratives, we see a lot of limits, and I bet a lot of women in this room can attest to that. We tell our girls that they can be authentic as long as it fits within a specific box of norms, almost exclusively pertaining to the aesthetic. But authenticity is not something that you can buy or work towards because you already have it inside of you.
This is also the age in girls when they're beginning to be objectified, an experience that's going to continue for a long time in their lives. So I would like you to think back to the first time that you remember being sexualized in an uncomfortable or uninvited way. I would like you to think about how you dealt with it externally in the moment, as well as internally. And I would like you to compare it to the last time that you were sexualized in an uncomfortable or uninvited way. That time might have been this week or this morning. By now you probably have a checklist. Step 1,
omit your gaze. Look anywhere but at the person or the group of people, preferably down.
Step 2,
ignore it. Pretend that it's not happening, because if you acknowledge it, then it's happening, and God forbid you embarrass the person who's embarrassing you.
And step 3,
if it persists, leave the location. Go ahead and give up your right to take up space as the brilliant human that you are.
Externally, you probably react the way that most of us do. And it may be very similar to the way you reacted that first time. You ignore it, you disengage, and you leave the situation. But internally, it may be very different because you've learned to identify these moments quickly and categorize them as either harassment or annoyances or a potentially dangerous situation or some guy just trying to be nice. Because this is something you've learned to deal with regularly, you've all become pros, whether you want to be or not, and it's become part of your daily survival.
But did you know that the first time that you are going to have to deal with this would be something that you would actually have to learn to navigate? And this is something that happens so frequently, so why don't we ever talk about it? And if you could go back and give your younger self advice about this, what would you tell them? What tools would you give them? And all of this comes down to a very multifaceted subject that affects everybody: gender expectation.
So because gender is all around us, we can be led to believe that gender is something that is objective. And by that I mean Gender is the aesthetics we place on men and women and what we believe to be their core qualities and interests. But we live in a multicultural society, right? We have access to a wealth of knowledge and people, and we have libraries, and we have the internet, and we have histories spanning thousands of cultures. And when we do just a little bit of digging, we know that what is considered female and feminine is different, depending on your culture. That's where you live and when you live.
Therefore, gender is subjective. I mean, we all know that a woman can be anything and a man can be anything, but we are all so affected by how our culture defines gender. Because none of us are islands, and we're affected by the world around us, and that's perfectly fine, as long as you keep it in mind. Therefore, I ask you, to you, what does a woman look like? Does she have long hair? Does she wear makeup? Does she climb Mount Everest? What is your definition of womanhood? And if you're a woman, how do you define it for yourself? And is your definition supported by your culture? And if it is not, what do you do? Or rather, what is done to you?
If you're not classically feminine, are you treated as masculine by default? If your hair or skin or body type or ableness doesn't match our very specific cultural beauty standards, do we deprive you of your womanness and your beauty? What do you do when a traditional gender role doesn't encompass you? And what do you do when your gendered consumer products diminish you? How do you learn to love the sex our culture treats as second?
So this is a lot, right? It's a ton of stuff. But these are the questions that our adolescent girls are dealing with all the time. And a lot of times without a safe place to express the feelings around it. And what we wanted to do was give a girl a place where she can throw everything up against the wall and see what sticks for her, all while having fun, making friends, and building a female positive community.
Both of us had really awesome private outlets in middle school. I did a lot of journaling, and Meredith did a lot of mixed media art. But solitary outlets are only part of what a developing person needs.
We both had the privileged opportunities to have outlets that were social. Speech and debate and theater classes were regular occurrences in both of our lives, and they gave us safe platforms to express ourselves in ways that were less inhibiting or stressful than middle school social navigations. Basically, they were places that allowed the both of us to be really weird. And they did a hell of a lot for us, but there was still this really important conversation that was missing about our gender. Because not all of the changes that you're going through can be taught in a science class or a sex ed class, if you're even lucky enough to have a sex ed class. There's so many things that you have to deal with that are never discussed, that are directly tied to your identities and your authenticities. Therefore, now that I'm a grown woman, I am able to look at and recognize the privileges that I have had, as well as where I could have used some more empowerment for my uniquenesses and my authenticities and my gender. A place that allowed me to embrace my names and also shed the ones that I didn't really care for, and also a place to put everyone else's names in perspective for myself. To learn and work with people who I might have assumed only had one or two names, but early on in my developing years discovered that everybody is multifaceted and everybody has a multitude of stories to tell.
So our mission at SheCrew is to support girls during a time of transition, focus their individual voice, create a safe space for self-expression, and facilitate a community that aids in the development of all of its members. So, we work hard to make our programming equally accessible for all girls in Chicago, and we use a donation-based model for all of our programming, because accessibility is knowing that a program can be available to you before you even apply.
We also provide food for our programming every day for our students and our instructors. It allows us to break bread as a community and aids to further the narrative of togetherness. Moreover, we feel that to fully understand yourself, you need to know and understand women who are different than you. Befriend women that are different than you. We strive to create a community with a diverse population that properly reflects this wonderful city that we live in here in Chicago. We hope to continue how we utilize this principle by one day having our She Crew participants actually be able to become the She Crew instructors themselves.
We strive for our students to trust their creative instincts and ideas, and we do this through both journaling and performance, the private and the social. And we focus on gendered issues, defining womanhood, and personal identity. In essence, a place to write and talk about all your names.
So, I know I want to hear your story. I know that I want to hear the stories of the girls who feel like they are so often forgotten, so often not considered in the conversation about our great population, so often ignored. But know that they have a voice. Know that they have artistic value. Know that they can change our communities, our schools, our cities, completely change the game. Know that they want to embrace and empower the world around them with their quirks and their weirdnesses and their art and their undeniable voices. Because we all deserve to take up space, whether that be in a journal or on a stage. Thank you.